Hello, my friends. Welcome to Two Priests on the Patio podcast. Here we gather in the quiet space between science and soul with Reverend Canon Ward and the Venerable Jeff Ward, partners in ministry and in life. We ask the deeper questions. What does it mean to be awake in this world? To suffer, to doubt, to believe, to begin again and again. This is a sanctuary for conversation. So come as you are.
Happy spring day. Welcome to Two Priests on the Patio. I'm Ward. I'm the priest at the Church of the Incarnation in Oakville.
And I'm Jeff Ward. I am the priest at St. Cuthbert's Church in Southeast Oakville. And it almost feels like a patio kind of day. We could actually be recording this outside today.
We could. It would be glorious. So there are only two of us today. Our dear beloved Che Marville has decided that we can fly on our own.
I'm nervous. Are you?
It's terrifying.
Yes. Where's the net?
But she says she has faith in us, and we have faith in each other, so let's do this.
Well, I have faith in God, and hopefully God will lead us. So, yes, would you like to get things started for us, though?
Absolutely. So today is the day before International Women's Day, the day on which we're recording this. And so I was pondering to myself, there is an International Women's Day. Jeff, why is there no International Men's Day?
That's a leading question, and I'm afraid that I'll step right into that pit. So why don't you explain to us why we have an International Women's Day?
Well, I think that the reason why we have International Women's Day is because it presents us with an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of women, economic, social, all of the achievements that women have made. And it's also a day when we receive a call to action and a reminder that there still is not equality between men and women, and that's something that we need to strive for the benefit of all.
And so what are we going to talk about today that is related to International Women's Day?
Mm-hmm. So we often turn to our scriptures, and I was thinking that we could start out by talking about the story of Adam and Eve that's in Genesis 2 and 3. Because I think that one of the reasons why there is a lack of equality amongst women and men is because people, both Hebrew people, Jewish people, and Christians turn to that scripture, and what they see there is an opportunity to blame women essentially for all of the sin of the world. Right? We have this passage where Adam is told by God in the garden not to eat from the tree of knowledge. And then a serpent comes along, and the serpent says to Eve and Adam was there, that in fact they would benefit from doing so, that they would understand good and evil if they did so. And Eve sees that the fruit is, a pleasure to the eye, that it's going to taste good, that it's going to increase her knowledge, her wisdom. And so she chooses to eat from that tree. And then Adam, who is with her, also eats from that tree. And we are told that the outcome of that is that there's going to be suffering, pain in childbirth, in a woman's labor, but also in a man's labor in the field. And this has been used throughout Christian history to blame women for what is sometimes called the original sin. That was coined, I think, mainly by St. Augustine.
And all of that because a snake talked Is that right?
That's the thing that stands out for me. I think it's really helpful for us to say up front that, and I'll just speak for myself, but I do not believe this literally happened. I do not believe it was a historical event. I think it is a myth. And not myth as in it's a lie, but myth as in it's a story that human beings have developed to understand our human experience and to answer some enduring questions. I mean, we wonder, why does labor and delivery cause pain? Why do we get so exhausted when we work hard every day? And why do we have to work so hard?
I ask that question very frequently, actually. I think also, we're referring to Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, which is the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. But in chapter 1, we also get a creation story, and it's very different than chapter 2 and chapter 3. And I think it's a reminder to us that just because it's written in Scripture doesn't mean it was meant to be an historical account of things. And I even think chapter 1 was the best stab that the ancients had at what maybe the universe, universal creation, the start of everything might have looked like. In some ways, it's not bad, but it's not accurate. But chapter 2 and chapter 3 give us a completely different idea of creation. And it doesn't seem to me to be something that was ever written to be some kind of account of actual creation. We get the story where Eve is actually created out of Adam, because apparently God thought that after the fact, he realized that Adam might be lonely, and therefore maybe he needed a partner, someone to coexist with, to live with. And so he created Eve in this story, and out of Adam literally pulling a rib out and creating Eve, he creates, because it's God as he in the Scripture, creates this woman who is a partner to Adam.
And notice partner,
yes.
Companion. And I think that rib is symbolic, right? It comes out of the side where you would have companionship, not out of his foot to be stepped on or his head to be dominated, but as a companion for him.
Yeah, and I don't think we mean to disparage the story, because I think the story, as you said, has meaning. Mythical stories have meaning. They're not just something for us to only poke fun at. I poked fun at the snake because the snake is talking, and we know that snakes don't talk. But
they do in myths.
That's right. Because myths aren't supposed to be accurate stories of reality, but they are supposed to represent things. And I think that's what this story is meant for. But unfortunately, it's not something that, especially people of our church, have historically, traditionally used that story for. And those who believe that Scripture is, written by God and is inerrant, in other words, we're supposed to believe every word of Scripture happened exactly as it was written, I think we then fall into this trap with this particular story, that it doesn't match with any kind of reality. And then we miss the point of the story being written at all. But the result of it is Eve being highlighted as the fallen woman, right? The fall of humankind. It isn't even just her that falls, according to our traditions. It's all of humanity has fallen. And as you said, inherited original sin simply because she ate the fruit, because she listened to the snake. And then we're told that she somehow talked Adam into this, and yet the Scripture just basically says she offered him fruit, not an apple, by the way, fruit, and then he just ate it. So there was nothing there that demonstrates for us any kind of malfeasance or trickery, except maybe on behalf of the serpent.
Yeah, and to make matters worse, I think, it has been used to say that we are forever and always sinful because of this one woman in this mythical story. And so people are born sinful. And theologians through the ages, and I think particularly St. Augustine, has advocated for children to be baptized as early as possible because they are born sinful and they need God's grace through baptism.
Which I think was particularly important at a time when infants didn't often live very long or didn't survive, right? So if you're really worried that this child's going to hell because they, are born with sin and then die with sin, you can understand why they were, so insistent. But the thinking was flawed about the original sin.
Right. And just as an aside, it's not this episode, but we don't believe in a literal hell. So stay tuned for another episode on that. But the other thing...
Will we go to hell for saying there's no hell? I'm not sure. We'll find out, I guess.
Yeah, we should ask the bishop, do you think?
Oh, don't go down that path yet. Okay.
But the other thing is that somehow Augustine also brought sex into the whole thing, and that somehow it was through the desire that leads to sexual intercourse amongst people that the sin is brought into the next generation. And so it made our intimacy into something that was sinful, and yet often not sinful for the man, but sinful for the woman.
So we probably should have an episode simply on how the church fathers and many of the church leaders throughout history have focused so much attention on sex, especially among so many of them who were celibate. So that would be something for us maybe to talk about another time. But it's absolutely a good point that this focus on this sexual immorality, how that came out of this story, is certainly beyond me. I don't see anywhere in the scripture that would tell us that that's what we should be reading from that.
No. And let's get back to sex a little bit later, because you spoke a few minutes ago about Genesis 1 and the creation story there, where God created in 6 days all that is materially and then rested on the seventh day. And then you sort of contrasted that with something that's been considered a creation story in chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis. So first of all, we have two different creation stories in the same book, and so that should pose questions for us. But what I find really interesting is that somehow we have globbed onto the story that is negative about humanity, that says that we are sinful. And yet in Genesis 1, God creates and says it is good. God creates and says it is good, and then God creates human and says that we are very good. And somehow we miss that. We would rather think of ourselves in a negative way. Where do you think that comes from?
I don't know, but I'm worried that it comes from God. So I don't want to blame God for that, but it does seem to be inherent in humans to see the bad things. I mean, look at social media, look at any kind of, communication in the world right now. People are attracted to the negative, are attracted to, the harmful more than they are the positive and the joyful. And I don't know why that is. I assume it has to do with us being focused on, protecting ourselves, right? So we have an innate desire or need to protect ourselves from things that might harm us. So we seem to be more sensitive to that. But I don't understand either. Mm-hmm. God, and I think God coming into the world through Jesus gives us that idea that this is what God really was hoping for us, was that joyfulness, that grace, that love, and not about that negativity. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the woman at the well, but there's just so many differences between what we read from second chapter of Genesis and then what we read in the Gospels.
Right. And I mean, how many of us, getting back to sex, as I said we would, sex should be something that's good, right? It promotes intimacy within a relationship. It produces children. What a beautiful gift we've been given. And yet, how many of us have been raised to think that it's wrong, that it's bad, that it's something that should only be used for procreation and not something that should be enjoyed and celebrated?
Yes, I've read from scientists, but people who study us and study our behaviors and say, so these are scientists, not just us as religious people, but I don't think God would have made it in such a way that we would want to keep doing it over and over again and make it so enjoyable unless it was something God was hoping that we would repeat. And by doing that, we're more likely to procreate because, we're not like other species that kill each other after they, are able to conceive. So I think there's a reason for that. I think God wanted us to be able to desire that over and over again. So I don't see why that in particular would be sinful either. And I do think that as long as it's between, people who are loving and consenting, it shouldn't matter, right? And it shouldn't be sinful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think what we've been talking about is that sometimes the scriptures are misinterpreted and that things are written into passages that maybe leave some things open for interpretation. And sadly, the interpretation is often negative. There is no mention of original sin in the passage about Adam and Eve. No mention of the fall. These are things that were layered onto that scripture passage later. Simply questions that I think arose in a patriarchal society about how it is that things are the way they are. But we see this kind of misinterpretation, I think, in our Christian scriptures as well, right? In our Gospels, we have a passage in John's Gospel, John 4, where Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at the well. Do you want to tell that story since I did Adam and Eve? Or?
Sure. And then I wouldn't mind making a comment about it afterwards. So Jesus comes to the well, and we are told that this is the well that is identified in Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, as Jacob's well. And Jesus arrives at the well. He's thirsty. He has, unlike, I guess, my assumption, which was there would always be some kind of a bucket or something at a well that people could draw from. There was nothing. You bring your own device to draw water, and he didn't have one. So he is sitting at the well, and the Samaritan woman shows up, and he asks her for a drink. He actually, according to our scriptures, basically demands, but he says, "Give me a drink." That's the first thing he does. Now, he's speaking to a woman who he's not supposed to be speaking to. He's doing this in public. It's someone he doesn't know. And she is a Samaritan woman. So traditionally at that time, Jewish people didn't speak to Samaritans because they were out of favor with each other. But also she's a woman, so he shouldn't be talking to her. Or I guess he could be demanding something of her, but that's not how it goes. He asks her for a drink, and then they get into a conversation. And he's asking her about her, but she's sort of, I don't want to say she's being cagey, but she wasn't saying everything about herself. And then he says to her, he says that she had had 5 husbands and the man that she is with now is not her husband. That's all he says, but he says that. And he says that to her, I believe, so that she realizes that he knows things about her, so that are very unique to her, very, important to her, personal to her, so that she realizes that he's more than just this man who showed up at the well. He's not judging her in that sentence. He's just identifying that. And then she starts asking him questions about, you're Jews and we're Samaritans, and we're told that this is where God is, and you guys say this is where God is. So you say God's in Jerusalem. We say that God is on Mount Gerizim. And Jesus basically says, well, God's everywhere. And so, you shouldn't be debating that. However, she then says something about, the Messiah. And he says, I am he, and reveals himself to her. Now, this is early in John's Gospel, so as far as we can tell, this is the first time Jesus has ever told anyone that he is from God. He is God, because this is John's way when he uses these I am phrases. He's echoing what we read in Exodus in the Hebrew scriptures, where God says, I am. When asked, what is your name? He says, I am. I am who I am. And that is what John uses over and over again to identify Jesus revealing who he is. And he does this first with her. She runs to her city, her town, her village, to tell everybody about this Jesus, and she believes he's the Messiah. She explains why, and apparently people believe her. Then the disciples show up, and then it goes on after that, but basically they're very concerned that he was talking to this Samaritan woman, and then it follows from there.
Mm-hmm. So we have really two lines of scripture that have been used to sully this woman's reputation. The first one is, it says, and it was noon, right? So this encounter happened at noon. Jesus is at the well. She shows up with her water jug, and it is noon. And many people have preached about how that indicates that she must have been some kind of outcast. She didn't go to the well with the other women who likely would have gone earlier in the day when it was cooler, but she had to go later, when it was hot out, so that she could avoid the whispers and the jeers from the other women. Except it says nothing like that in the passage. It simply says, it was noon.
Can I make a confession at this point?
I think you should.
I have preached a sermon like that because I had been taught that was exactly what that story was supposed to be telling us.
Yeah, that's what the commentaries say, isn't it?
It is. Older commentaries, not so much newer comments about this passage.
Mm. And then we have Jesus saying to her that she had 5 husbands, and the husband that she's with now is not her husband, and that statement points to the fact that she must be a loose, immoral, fallen woman to have been with so many men. But
because she divorced all those men and remarried, and now she's living in sin because she's not even married to the guy.
But did she divorce all those men?
We don't know that.
Well, I'll tell you what I suspect. I suspect she did not, because if you look at the time and the place, it was men who had control over these things. A man could write a certificate of divorce and divorce his wife very easily and just move on. A woman did not have that same ability and was much less likely to want to end a relationship where she had the protection of a husband, because women on their own were very vulnerable economically. If they did not have a family to take them back in, a brother or a father who was willing to support them, they were in real trouble. So what's more likely is that her husband's died, possibly abandoned her. Maybe they divorced her, but it's really unlikely that she initiated the ending of those relationships.
It is interesting, though, how people early in history and throughout history have filled in that gap and made the story up that, well, she must have divorced all these people. Or maybe she was so horrible that they just all had to keep divorcing her. But that all of that is absent from the text. There's nothing there that says anything like that. All Jesus says is she's had 5 husbands. There are other stories in Scripture where women have had multiple husbands, and it wasn't their fault. It was just, their husband died, and the woman who ends up with how many of the brothers as her husbands, basically an echo of this story, which is one brother she marries, he dies, so then because of the way the tradition was, to protect her, another brother married her, and then he died. And boy, you would have thought eventually she would have found a different family to marry into, because these guys were not in a good gene pool, I guess. But the reality is that we have no idea what her circumstances are, but we read into that she must have been doing something immoral, and therefore that's why she had so many husbands. And
notice that it's immoral, right?
Yes.
Not just that she was an unpleasant person who got, divorced, but that she was immoral. That she had done something sinful, and there's a sexual undertone in that.
The only thing I could figure that maybe was the reason why she got divorced so many times was the same reason that she challenged Jesus right in that moment and started asking these deep questions. Maybe she was too smart and she was just challenging the men in her life too much.
Kind of like your wife?
Yeah, maybe. I wouldn't say that ever, though.
No, I'm sure you wouldn't. But you know what else this brings to my mind is that often when we go through hardship in life, when we go through tough times, that's when we reach out for God. That's when we often experience the most spiritual growth. And I wonder if, in fact, what Jesus was pointing out is that woman's had a difficult life. You know, she, for whatever reason, has had multiple relationships that have broken down. That's hard. And notice that her response is not to make excuses for herself. It's not to flinch and pull away. It's to start asking theological questions. And possibly because she's been through those difficult times, she has grown in wisdom and understanding. And so now she has God, the Messiah, with her. And so she is taking advantage of that and asking the important questions.
I think you're hitting on something that is I found important about this passage in Scripture. We have this focus on her as this, again, fallen woman, this person who, would have been there because she was embarrassed or she was ashamed. The Scripture doesn't say anything like that. Instead, what we miss then by focusing on that is this exchange they actually have, one of deep respect, one of dignity, one of care for each other. And that should have been something that should have struck everybody. Oh my gosh, what a difference, that was relative to what normally might have happened at the well at that time between two people in those circumstances. So we miss out on this whole Christ perspective, this, what Jesus is doing there that is so radically different. And then we miss out on that because we're focused on the wrong things.
Mm-hmm. And I think if anything, she stands out to me as a good disciple of Jesus and an evangelist. I mean, she has the confidence to go to her city and tell people about him.
No offense to Peter, because he is, I think a very loyal, faithful disciple. But he doesn't ask these deep questions. At least we don't see that anywhere in the Gospels. She ends up asking the deep questions and having this very authentic conversation with Jesus that we don't see. I mean, when the disciples show up, all they're asking him is, what do you mean? Where'd you get your food? Or how? Just very basic questions that were not so deep. And here she's the one. She has this very long conversation with him that we don't see with any of the other disciples or anybody else really in Scripture. Right. So I think we miss all of that because we're so focused on the fact that she had 5 husbands and now she's living with a guy. We don't even know what that situation is because there's no description about that. There's no detail about what's happened there. Mm-hmm. So anyway, it's as you said, it is an illustration of how we have misinterpreted Scripture throughout centuries. And
how quickly we have been to condemn women.
Always.
Yeah. And interestingly, in the Eastern Church, she has been given the name Photina, and that means enlightened one. And where Jacob's Well is, in Nablus, in the West Bank, there has been a church that's been built over and around Jacob's Well, and the name of that church is Saint Faustina. So, Photina, sorry. So the church is named after her. So there is a certain segment, I think, of Christian tradition who has recognized her as an enlightened one, as somebody who has a positive character, and not this fallen woman that so many of us have been taught about.
I know we spoke earlier about how this Scripture and the one we were talking about from Genesis chapter 2 and 3 have affected women throughout history, as though it's only been in the church, but it is something that is translated throughout history, throughout societies, regardless. I would say because of the Genesis story, we're talking about Jews, Christians, and Muslims, right, who would use that as their their scripture and their guidance around, the creation stories. So we're talking about a lot of people in history who were affected by this and who followed those similar teachings, right? And the impact on women has been dramatic for a very long time. And the subjugation of women, which is what we talked about also when we were talking about that Genesis story, that dominance of patriarchy, right, which was attributed to the same passage of Scripture where it says, you're supposed to, have your husband dominate you, right? From a story that we believe is a mythical story, which was really representative more of the time than it was about a teaching from God.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I don't think the passage actually says we should be dominated, we women should be dominated by our husbands, but it is an acknowledgement that that is what the experience was at the time. Yeah. And, we have other passages of Scripture where, interestingly, women are condemned for engaging in exactly the same behavior as men. There's a passage where a group of men want to stone a woman to death because she has been caught in adultery. And Jesus reaches down and he draws in the sand for a little bit, and then he invites the one that has no sin to cast the first stone. And we are told that these men go away beginning with the eldest, right? The one who's likely sinned more because he's had more years in which to make mistakes and do things that are wrong.
I'd like to think it was also because he was wise, but because of his age. But yes.
Yes. So what about the man that she committed adultery with?
That does seem to be somewhat prevalent in Scripture wherever these sorts of things surface, is the men are nowhere to be found and the women are condemned. And I don't see an explanation of that anywhere. So I then just have to assume that everything was always blamed on women, and therefore they would be the ones who would receive that punishment. But the punishment was clear in Hebrew law, which was, anybody in an adulterous relationship would be punished up to being stoned to death. So if she was going to be stoned to death, they should have been side by side, but they're not.
Mm. And of course, nobody should be stoned to death. A couple of Sundays ago, we recognized Freedom Sunday, which is a day when we acknowledge the horror of human trafficking and modern-day slavery. This is something that happens in Canada, where we live. It is very prevalent, unfortunately, right in the area where we live because there are major highways with hotels nearby. And one of the statistics that I read that is really even just hard to fathom is that 93% of the people who are trafficked in Canada are women. And that includes people who are trafficked for forced labor. So typically humans are trafficked either for sexual exploitation or forced labor. But 93% are women.
And why do you think that is?
I think because these passages of Scripture and other traditions in our society have said that women are lesser, that women have no value, are throwaway, and can be used. I also think that there has been two kinds of women, right? There have been the Marys, the virgins, or the Eves, the temptress.
When you say two kinds of women, you mean how women are portrayed.
Yes, how people are sometimes thought about.
Not how they actually are.
Right.
Right.
I've heard it said, there are women that men date and there are women that men marry, right? And presumably they would be dating Eve and marrying Mary, the Virgin Mary.
Yes.
Why do you think?
Well, I think everything you said, but I also think because women can be dominated often by men, so therefore it would be easier for those people to be trafficked. But I also think that if anything, our recent history has told us is that, men who have some kind of desire for women or unfortunately girls. I'm talking, I'm thinking about Jeffrey Epstein and those who were involved in whatever he did, felt they did it because they could and because, I don't know. I'm not sure what that desire is, but the outcome is that they feel that they can do that and that they can get away with it. So that's why I think that's also the case. Yeah. Now, you said that we received a question from somebody listening, and I was wondering if we wanted to address that question now.
Well, and I think we are. So the question came from a lawyer, and the lawyer has dealt with many cases of abuse or rape and defended women in those situations, and really struggled with why the world is such that that can be the case. Why is it that women are not as strong as men, or that men feel the need or the opportunity to dominate and cause harm to women or show their power over women in that way? And it's an interesting question for us to wrestle with, I think.
Especially when we are looking at International Women's Day approaching, right? This, and I realize that we seem to be making at least progress in shining a light on these things and starting to address these things. But, we made a little bit of, forward movement with what, was the Me Too movement, this idea that maybe this can't just be acceptable behavior or something that should be ignored. I mentioned Jeffrey Epstein a moment ago, and it is an example of people just being able to bury these things because these are powerful men in influential situations, and therefore they're able to get away with this. And I think it's all related to each other.
Mm-hmm. And it happens in the political sphere as well, where female politicians are often attacked viciously online, threatened and shamed, and in a way that male politicians just aren't. They're not subjected to that same thing.
I agree with that. I do think it's more prevalent in certain societies than others, and I think there's been some headway made. I'm thinking about places like New Zealand, but every female leader that I have read about has said that they have been attacked simply for their gender in ways that their male counterparts have not. Yeah. And we were talking earlier about other places in Scripture. We were talking about the woman who was caught in adultery. That's all we know about her. That's what the Scripture says. She was caught in adultery. But we could also be talking about Mary Magdalene and other women in Scripture who have been highlighted as people who were... Mary Magdalene, why don't you tell us a little bit about her? But here's somebody who has all sorts of things attributed to her, I'll say it now, by men in the church through history that don't show up actually in Scripture.
No, that's right. She was a close companion of Jesus. We are told in our Scriptures that he cast demons out of her, whatever that means, whether that was a mental illness or a spiritual illness, or we don't really know. But we do know that Mary Magdalene was among the women who followed Jesus, sought to live his teachings, supported he and the other disciples financially, was there at the crucifixion, remained faithful when many of the men turned and did not stand by Jesus, did not betray Jesus, and was one of the women in the garden on the day of resurrection. And yet somehow she has been painted with the brush again of a fallen woman. And yet she was the disciple to the disciples.
And even where, we have the description in the Gospels that she was possessed by demons. So were other people, by the way, in Scripture, possessed by demons, and Jesus healed them in some cases, and whatever those demons were exorcised from them. But we have no idea what that even means, because quite often the word demons, as they show up in Scripture, weren't evil possession. They were mental illness or some other aspect of what we would consider today to be natural illnesses. And so we have no idea what those, quote, demons were, but they seem to be attributed to her as, of course, sexual immorality. She had to be a prostitute. That has to be what it was. It couldn't have been something else. But nothing in Scripture tells us that that's what that was. And so here's somebody who is one of the most faithful, loyal disciples who actually believe Jesus is who he says he is. Remember, she's like, we think, either the first or one of the first people to show up at his tomb at his resurrection. So why was she there? She wasn't there to see if he was actually resurrected. She was there because she wanted to prepare him for his final burial, right? To make sure that he was dealt with dignity and care, because she loved him and she respected him. So, but she was there. And no one else went, like the male disciples. They're the ones who end up hiding in the room later, and she's, as far as we can tell, she's not one of those people who was hiding in the room. So she shows things that other disciples don't, and yet we never see her lifted up that way. But instead, what we see is things attributed to her that do not show up in Scripture.
No.
And I don't know where else they would show up, because it's our only evidence of who these folks were at that time, right, is what we read in Scripture.
Yeah. So I think the question is, what do we do about this? And how do we improve the situation? How do we level the playing field and promote equality amongst all people of all genders? And I think one of the starting points, particularly for us, is better interpretation of Scripture. And calling things into question and looking for what's actually there and what's not there.
So how are you going to answer those questions to, say, a woman in your congregation when you're talking to them or preaching to them?
So what question?
Well, we've had all of this poor interpretation, bad interpretation. So what do you think we should do about that, if that's the question you're getting from them?
Yeah. I think we need to talk about it. I think we need to teach and be open and acknowledge mistakes of the past. I mean, I honestly was delighted when you talked about the fact that you yourself have preached about the woman at the well, and that she must have been ashamed. It was a shameful situation. So I think there's a lot of teaching that can happen and a lot of encouragement. I think that also seeing women in positions of leadership, whether it be in the church or in our society or in business or in the community, I think those are important things. And for us to raise those people up. And it's not always men that are pushing women back down. Sometimes it's other women. I remember when I started at a parish back in 2011, and 2 people left the parish because I was the first female rector that they had, and they could not accept that I was a woman, and they were women who left the parish. So it's deeply ingrained.
Now, you and I have both preached and taught. So I confessed what I confessed earlier. Basically, what I remembered preaching was that this was a possibility, that the reason why she showed up at noon was because she was, that at least she was, I'll just say ashamed, but it was because other people, and I'm going to say this, probably other women, because she would have been, hanging out mostly with other women, were maybe saying things to her that were just hurtful, like why at least saying things like, aren't you unlucky that all your husbands are dying? Or why is it your husbands are divorcing you, etc.? So I wasn't attributing anything more to it other than it would just be easier for her to show up at the well at noon than to deal with all of that earlier in the day. But there is so many other more straightforward explanations for this. Like there was a special need for her to get more water, and that's why she went at that time of the day. She couldn't wait till the next day because she can't just turn the tap on. Right? I mean, there's some very basic ideas. But you and I have both taught and preached what we're talking about today, this idea that Scripture has been misused and that women have been maltreated over centuries because of that. And I think I told you that after having preached about, that Genesis story, the reactions I got were quite interesting between men and women who did react to what I said. Mm-hmm. Some men questioning my interpretation of Scripture by saying what I said. Meanwhile, all I was saying was exactly what the Scripture said. I didn't actually interpret anything from that. And yet the women that talked to me about it afterwards were so relieved that I was willing to say this out loud and to say it to everyone, including men, and how they were so happy. I didn't realize how much they'd been thinking about this because none of them had ever said that to me. And I was just so pleased with that reception of that this was something that was really making a difference for them.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I think that would be helpful for us in terms of our pastoral care or teaching is to help people to understand that Jesus taught a new covenant. And so there's many parts of the Scriptures that he was raised with, the Hebrew Scriptures, that he says, you have heard it said, and then quote that Scripture, but I say to you. So he has a new covenant that replaces some of those teachings that are in the Hebrew Scriptures. And if we look at this passage from John's Gospel with the woman at the well, let's look at what we are taught there. Let's look at all passages of Scripture through the lens of Jesus' teachings. And what we see in this passage is Jesus intentionally engaging with a woman, a foreigner, a person of a different faith, revealing himself to her, engaging as a partner in a conversation with her, treating her with dignity, honoring her, never once shaming or condemning her. And I think that if we approach things always through that lens, every passage of Scripture, and look at it that way, I think we can't go too far wrong.
And if I might just close on that passage with what you just said, why did the writer of that gospel write that story at all? And why did that gospel writer write it that way? If it was meant to shame her, why wouldn't the gospel writer have actually said that? Why wouldn't Jesus have condemned her? And instead, it's written very differently and captured differently. And I believe that was for a reason. And I also believe it was so that it would reflect the way Jesus, as you were putting it, was teaching us something new and different.
So we're two priests on the patio, and we thank you for listening today. We hope that you will subscribe and like and share.
Follow and send us questions.
Yes, if you have questions that you would like us to discuss, to wrestle with. And we hope that Che Marville will join us next time for Two Priests on the Patio.
Thank you very much, and have a wonderful, blessed day.
Two priests on the patio. Sure hope you enjoyed the show. If there's anything you want to know, just ask. Two priests on the patio. Yeah.
Well, friends, thank you for being with us. If this stirred something in you, share the episode and subscribe. The path of awakening isn't linear. It's layered, lived, and often lonely. But you are not alone. We'll meet you in the stillness, in our prayers. We'll meet you in the questions. And until next time, Stay compassionate, stay open, stay awake.